Shabbat Shalom again. I don't think I'm stealing anyone's job. I just wanted to call attention to a couple of things that are upcoming this summer. If you are enjoying being outside in this beautiful weather, we invite you 2 weeks from today on August 17th is our Shabbat at the shore. So there will be services here, but you can also join us at the beach for Kabbalat Shabbat services for Erev Shabbat. And then it is August 23rd. Is that the date? Is our concert in Beverly Hills, Concert on Canyon. So you won't want to miss that, of course. All that information can be found after Shabbos, of course, on our website. I also want to say if you are visiting, if you're new, please make sure you can introduce yourself to us or introduce yourself to someone after the service. We want to be able to welcome you and wish you a Shabbat Shalom. And I think anything else that I'm missing, there's learning going on this summer. Anything else I'm missing should be in your Eyes on Wise, so you can check there if I missed anything, which is possible. Earlier this summer, I had the good fortune, or I guess foresight, in buying the tickets to see Paul Simon at the Hollywood Bowl. Promoted, at least, as his farewell tour before retirement, he closed the show with a stark, almost acoustic set of some of his most beloved songs. And while I could chalk it up to simple nostalgia, I found myself quite teary as he began the soft words of The Sounds of Silence. As I mentioned earlier, I was back and forth on a plane this week because I had the good fortune with much generosity to spend the past week as part of a cohort of Jewish professionals, educators, rabbis, and more who are thinking about the role of relationships in our work and in the Jewish community as a whole. It was really a week of rich and deep learning, both textual and academic. It was a week of deep self-reflection and study, and it pushed lots of buttons and boundaries in all the right ways. And it was a week of connection, of telling our stories and listening to others. And this week's parasha, Ekev, opens with listening. Last week we heard the perhaps primal demand, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. And so echoing that, the book of Deuteronomy again turns to this verb in saying, V'haya Ekev tishma'un, if you obey, or if you hearken, if you hear and heal, as in heal, boy. Shema is one of the key words of the book of Deuteronomy, appearing no less than 92 times. And in most versions, in most translations, it's translated differently throughout the text. It's translated as hear, listen, hearken, obey. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks speaks of the untranslatability of the verb lishmoa. He says, in general, when you encounter a word in any language that is untranslatable into your own, you're close to the beating pulse of that culture. To understand an untranslatable word, you have to be prepared to move out of your comfort zone and enter a mindset that is significantly different from yours. Several years ago, when my clergy team in New York decided that we would learn and introduce the Shema in sign language to our congregation, the American Sign Language teacher explained the challenge of this prayer in particular. In questions that now seem obvious but weren't, she asked, what sign do you use to tell deaf people something that they physically cannot do? What does it mean, she asked us, to ask people who cannot hear to listen? What does it mean to tell them to hear? And so she taught us, and we used the sign for pay attention, Shema. Nellie Morton, a feminist theologian, tells a powerful story in her book called Beloved Image. She writes, it was in a small group of women who had come together to tell our own stories that I first received a totally new understanding of hearing and speaking. I remember well how one woman started, hesitating and awkward, trying to put the pieces of her life together. Finally, she said, I hurt. I hurt all over, but I don't know where to begin to cry. And she talked on, and her story took on fantastic coherence. And when she reached a point of most excruciating pain, no one moved. No one interrupted. Finally, she finished. After a silence, she looked from one woman to another. You heard me. You heard me all the way. She looked directly at each woman in turn and then said slowly, I have a strange feeling you heard me before I started. You heard me to my own story. We live in a world of sound. We are surrounded by buzzing and beeping and honking and whooshing and talking and texting and chatting and typing. We are surrounded by words and by noise all the time. And we spend a lot of that time, I think, in Paul Simon's words, hearing without listening. So in my house, with a preschooler and a toddler, we talk a lot about good listening, and I'd say it works about 40% of the time. And while maybe my toddler and preschooler understand it, maybe they don't, because maybe I understand it and maybe we don't, listening, our Torah teaches, is an act of faith. It is an act of bravery, and it is an act of vulnerability. To listen to someone, not just to hear them, is to be deeply present for them. There is a midrash, a rabbinic story, that teaches that when God spoke to us at Mount Sinai, Lefi kolchan shel kol echad ve'echad, haya hadibor medaber imo, that God's speech came to each one of us, to each individual according to our capacity, that we heard God's voice as only we were able. And another teaching, maybe a companion to that, tells us that shmiat ha'ozen, a listening ear, is a key virtue by which we can acquire Torah, by which we can receive knowledge and wisdom and enlightenment. Rabbi Sachs says, listening is the greatest gift we can give to another human being. To be listened to be heard, to know that someone else takes us seriously, that is a redemptive act. Listening is an act of love. In just over a week, we begin the month of Elul, the sacred time leading up to the High Holy Days. And each day of the month of Elul, at least in Ashkenazi tradition, is ushered in with a sound, the sound of the shofar. Next month, when we stand for the call of the shofar during the service for Rosh Hashanah, we stand with a blessing that commands us to lishmoa kol shofar, to lishmoa, that same verb, the sound of the shofar. Do we hear it? Do we listen to it? Do we obey it? There is a rabbinic teaching, a Mishnah, that asks that very question. What happens, the rabbis want to know, if someone is walking by the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah just as the shofar service begins, and in walking by they happen to hear the sound of the shofar? Has he fulfilled his obligation to hear the sound of the shofar? It depends, the rabbis say. If she simply heard it with no intentionality, then no, she hasn't fulfilled the obligation and she needs to go back and hear it again. But if he listens, if it is an intentional experience, then yes, that encounter fulfills the obligation. And so too with us and the month of Elul, and maybe so too with us and one another. Do we hear the real or metaphorical shofar and simply note the calendrical fact that summer is, moving along and we're looking at its close? Or do we stop? Do we allow the sound of the shofar or someone next to us to move us or to shake us, to inspire something within us? What might happen to us if we stop just hearing and start listening? Who might we become in that moment and moving forward? Who might we help others become? And who might give us the gift of listening to us? Could we be heard into our own story, a new story? And what might that story sound like? Shabbat Shalom.